Alexander Thom, Come the Time, Come the Man, presented by Robin Heath. In this lecture, Robin gives a detailed account of the father of archaeoastronomy and discoveries of complex geometries in stone circles. It's a biography of the late, great Alexander Thom, including some unpublished works. Recorded live at Megalithomania Conference 2006.
Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you can all hear me. Is it fine at the back? Yeah? Good. Well, I'd be glad to know, after yesterday I took a massive course of DMT this lunchtime, but you'd be also glad to know, if you were even thinking it, that the 20-minute period is over, that in fact it's digital meltdown therapy. So we've had a few technical problems which we've solved, and we'll go straight in. If you want to find a character of great interest in your life, if you like, it's a solar hero or someone you can latch onto, even a solar heroine, then you'd be hard-pressed to find someone with a more interesting life than Alexander Thom. I want to spend some time, the lectures in 3 parts basically, looking at him with photographs that have never been seen before, many thanks to the family of the late professor. I want to show a film, which is sort of nice and cuddly and will make you all feel good. And then I want to show you some research that's going on at the moment, which has really been going on in parallel with the sky and landscape courses that I run with Irene Iris in Wales, and has been instrumental in convincing the university that in fact the bridge, the huge chasm between academia and what used to be called the New Age, which isn't a meaningful term really anymore, can be sewn together. It's also very interesting to note, before we start, that this man has almost been completely airbrushed out of archaeology. If you go through any university library and look at the archaeology textbooks for undergraduates, you may find the odd reference to his 16-month calendar. You may find some dismissive remarks about the megalithic yard as a unit of length, and you might find some other bits and pieces. But by and large, looking in the index, you'll sometimes, and indeed many times, you'll seldom see his name mentioned. Come to Glastonbury and walk 2 doors down to the Speaking Tree second-hand bookshop, go through any of the books on this subject, and you'll find not just his name mentioned in the index, but you'll find probably about 30 or 40 references to him. So we've got to find out what's going on, and these photos will reveal something of the character of them. I want you to have some fun with these photos, because the first fact about, and I mustn't use the word fact apparently now, but the first fact about Alexander Thom is that he was born on the 26th of March, 1894, which means that he was born a Victorian. And he was born at the end of that massively productive period where the world was surveyed by people like David Clarke and George Moncur and George Airy, and had a belief that which we all had until the 60s, that the technological fix was going to be great. But I don't think Alex Thom was at all really political. He only recorded and reported what he found, and he left other people to interpret it. So I want to show you, first of all, the first photograph of Alex Thom as an adult, and it's rather revealing of his character. Remember, and this is where we go from facts to something else, he was an Aries with Capricorn rising. There's a picture of Alexander Thom, who moved age 7 to this building in the background, the hill at Dunlop, which is about 30 miles from southwest of Glasgow in Ayrshire. And that's him on his TM motorbike, about 1926. They're great little photographs, and we'll run through some of them, and I'll tell you something of his life. Obviously, he was a mechanical engineer. You'd need to be running one of those. Notice the acetylene lamp and various other things that you don't see on modern motorbikes. That's him working in that house, and that is a typical period piece of the sort of late 20s, early 30s. Notice the pipe, a truly civilized individual. And there's a painting that Alexander Thom did, and actually it's a very good painting. It's called The Herring Fishers, and he did it live in situ, going out fishing with herring. There's another acetylene lamp, and there's the herring fishers bringing in nets, I think this man might be being ill over the side, but he's probably bringing in a net. And actually it's quite a good bit of artwork. And he sketched throughout his life. He also took huge blocks of wood and carved chains from them. It was his standard procedure of passing time on the train between Oxford and Glasgow when he was at Oxford University. I don't know who swept up the compartment afterwards. There's something that's come back into fashion. He lived on a farm and took it over in 1924 with the death of his father. But he built that windmill, and that was the first electricity supply, I think, in Ayrshire to be supplied to a farm building. And you can see from that his expertise, by that time he had a Doctor of Science, which is it's like 4 stages up from having a PhD, and had got so many awards that his name was paling into insignificance with 4 letters compared to about the 25 letters he had after his name. So we've got a very practical guy here. We've got a guy who likes to find answers to technical problems. Then family expanding. He'd married Jeannie, who's standing there. She was called Sis. It was a family called her Sis. He married her and produced 3 children, and that's her standing by the unclothed version of the prefab he built to provide room. And then there's a couple of kids on the roof there doing all sorts of things they shouldn't be, all made out of blue asbestos, as befits the prefabs of the time. His great-grandson has recently had permission to restore the building as long as he doesn't use the blue asbestos. Now, this is a man who loved sailing, and nothing he liked better in his summer was to do a thrash from the south of Scotland, from the Clyde, right up to the Isle of Lewis in the top, through some of the most dangerous water in the British Isles. And I think you can see from this his appearance on this photograph that he is actually, enjoying what he's doing. He's got 2 of his nephews with him, and that's his wife, Jeannie. I don't know, I haven't been able to identify where the photo is, but someone will in the future, I'm sure. And there's an unfortunate photograph where he looks remarkably like Oswald Mosley. And I want to just say a few words about this gentleman on his left-hand side, because without that gentleman on the left-hand side, I don't think Tom would ever have done what he did in his life. This is his uncle William, Willie as he was known in Scotland, who was quite a wealthy man, and early in Tom's career, he paid for him in 1912 to go to a surveying course in Loch Eck in Scotland, and it's amazing how amnesia kicks in when you're up here, I can assure you. And he went to Loch Eck, E-C-K, and you can look it up. And he paid for Tom to go on this course, which was being taught by none other than David Clarke, who wrote the master textbook on geodetic and plane surveying, two volumes published around 1908. And this led to Tom, he was refused military service in the First World War because of a heart condition, something which affected him a little bit throughout his life. And he went to Canada to survey for the Canadian Pacific Railway as a chainman and theodoliter. They still tried to get him in the war at the end, but again, his medical condition precluded that. And there's a family photo taken in about 1928 of Jeannie, his wife, who was born on the same day as Alexander Thom. So 2 Aries on a boating trip, you can imagine, must have been quite sparky. There's Alexander Thom with the pipe. There's his son Archie, and we'll see more of him later. And there's 2 members of the family that the family today can't identify for me, but it's in progress. His daughter, who's 80, is still alive, and I'm going to try and get the names of those 2 people. This is all going in the biography I'm collating at the moment for the man. There's a good picture of the man, again on a boat. His nickname was the Skipper, or Sandy. Sandy is clear from his hair, and the Skipper because basically that's what the family called him. A.T. was another nickname. He was a man of many, many names, all short. Now that's the first photograph I've been able to find trawling through the entire family's archives of anything resembling anything I have a right to talk about today. I presume that some of you in this room will know what stone circle that is. Absolutely. You can't fail to notice sort of... hello, the microphone's gone off there. Now, that is Tom's second son, Alan, and Tom was there in 1935, about a year after he sailed into Loch Rogue and saw Callanish, which set him off asking a fundamental question. How, in an era when there was no pole star, did the ancients define a very accurate north-south line at Callanish? And this fired his interest. And come the time, come the man is a very good phrase. He already had surpassed most normal mortals' abilities in mechanical engineering. He designed aeroplanes, he designed flying boats for the Norman Thompson Aircraft Company and therefore the Gosport Aircraft Company. He'd gone to Glasgow University as a lecturer in the late 20s, and he also was an excellent theodolitist. He'd learned how to survey the proper way with the experts of the time. And furthermore, he was a first-class astronomer, and it was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. Indeed, he had corrected the orbit of a comet and informed the Russian government to inform the man who discovered the comet in 1915, and his figures were right, and the Russian observatory's figures were wrong. So we're dealing with quite a high-power individual. So when later on a television program, on mainstream telly, on the Chronicle program, of which I have some slides later, he said, in terms of their thinking ability, the megalith builders were probably superior in intelligence to myself. That was rather a dangerous remark to make, because it makes the rest of us recognize something that we don't want to look at. And this is in the era before dumbing down of television documentaries. Now, there's another stone circle, which I'm sure 90% of people who've been there will recognize. There's the Rollright stones, and that's a photograph taken in the early 1940s, in the summer, I think, of 1940. It's very hard. None of these photos are dated. You have to do it from the fashion statement, and also the type of theodolite, because this theodolite went out, he stopped using this one after the war. And there's a staged photograph that was a rush, as they're known, for the pilot of the Chronicle documentary. And you can tell it's staged because actually no one ever just looks like that when they're with a theodolite. And if you've any sense, you get someone else to write the bookings down. So you get a sucker to do that. And I'm blessed to have taken my dear partner over moor and fen many times, getting wet and cold, to do that task. Well, there's the family as it was at the end. There's Archie Thom, looking very 1930s. That's Beryl, who's still alive. She was the youngest of the three children. That's Alan, who unfortunately lost his life in a civil flying accident right at the end of the Second World War, in a Lockheed Hudson that crashed going into Leeds Airport on a weekend trip to see his girlfriend. And this hit Alexander Thom very badly, as it undoubtedly would anybody. And at that time, he'd just designed the biggest wind tunnel that had ever been built at Farnborough. He was the principal scientific officer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, where he single-handedly, as a principal scientific officer, dealt with the issues of designing airflow over wings. And all the later Spitfires and all the subsequent aeroplanes up to and including the later jets in the post-war period were all tested in that wind tunnel. And there was a big furore a few years ago when they wanted to demolish it to make way for a leisure park in Farnborough. Archie's girlfriend, subsequently with Archie, of course, no parthenogenesis there, produced children of which the granddaughter was my contact with the Thom family when Archie died in 1995. Beryl lives up at near Fort William, and Alexander Thom's wife there, Jeannie, Sis, is standing there by a very grumpy Alexander Thom. I had a feeling that the reason he was grumpy was that this was an automatic exposure, which is guaranteed to bring out the worst in any male, female, or animal trying to attempt it. And it had all gone wrong, and you can see that on his face. In fact, he looks a bit like Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator on that one. There's a portrait from Brasenose College, Oxford. After the war, he landed the chair of engineering at Oxford, and there's still a building there called the Thom Building, but unfortunately it's a chromium and steel building built in the 60s. But there's a staged photograph of him at work. There's him working at out at Broga with his son Archie. A typical photograph. He wore a Yeah, we're back online. Apparently it's something to do with digital cameras and phones, this problem, so perhaps you'd just stamp on your mobile phone and that would secure it. So this is a typical picture of with his sort of Afghan hat. You may have gathered already that putting this guy into the New Age context was a bit strange. One word, there aren't many facts apparently, but one that we can use here is that Alexander Thom was no hippie. There's Archie, who used to serve from the back of a Range Rover, a sort of early version of Stones. And there's Alexander Thom at Brasenose at some unnamed function. And there's Alexander Thom in 1973, where with Richard Atkinson and a couple of other colleagues who were excellent surveyors, he was convinced by Atkinson, he didn't want to do it, but he was convinced to do a 3-month work surveying Stonehenge. When given the original plan, the one that's in most of the textbooks, he found it so laughingly inaccurate that he insisted that he started from scratch, which is what he then did. Richard Atkinson, who wrote the definitive book on Stonehenge in the 50s, was implemental in identifying the centres of stone holes. The two of them were very, very good friends, which dispels some of the myth between academia and people who make radical discoveries outside of normal archaeology. There's him working in his chicken shed. The farm ran adjacent to a railway, and at some stage he bought some rolling stock and hauled it up to near the house because his wife used to complain that, as they do, and so he converted a chicken house, and most of his work, indeed, the office work he called it, was done there. And there's 4 generations of the Thom family as Thom reached the end of his life. That's Ewan, that's Archie, that's another Archibald Strang, Thom, and that's Alexander. Now, by this time, he was suffering from cataracts, and he had a very serious eye operation, and he was partially sighted. And what happened then was that he carried on living after his wife died in 1977 at the house he built, but he couldn't manage very well. This is despite taking a cold dip in any weather in a bath that was fed from a large whiskey barrel full of water. A very fit man. First thing he would do when invited to other people's houses was first of all deliver 100 weight of oatmeal for his porridge when he arrived, and open all the windows and switch the heating off. But his eyesight was failing, and he had a bad fall, did his hip in, and eventually had to go and live with his sister at Banavie, which is near Fort William. The last photo of Thom before he died, I think, was taken by Ewan Mackay, but this is a man who was registered blind, but was still dictating papers for various astronomical bodies and on his work. By this time, people had hounded on his work, so that's the last photo of him. Bit of a cool dude at 91. There's his machine for the talking books for the blind. Record player, had a huge wireless setup. I've been in this room, and he had a clock growing out of his head. And so that's a quick view of the photographs of Alexander Thom's life, and I hope that that's given you something of a picture of the man. There are very few shots of him smiling, and we'll correct that later. What I would now like to do is look at what happened after he died. He died in November 1985, and Archaeoastronomy magazine, an American magazine that championed archaeoastronomy, published this photo of him with an obituary calling him, and I think correctly, the father of modern archaeoastronomy. Of course, we have to go back to Stukely's assertion that Stonehenge was aligned to midwinter, and there are a whole other group of people, Boyce Somerville and Norman Lockyer in particular. But this guy started asking serious, radical questions about the past. A much better photo, in my view, is the other one in the set that were taken, and that's that one, which I think shows something of the finesse of the man, because he has rather interesting eyes there, and still has that moustache. And now we move on to the documentary. Now, almost the zenith of Thom's career was that he had a chance meeting with Magnus Magnusson, if you remember, did Mastermind for years, and Paul Johnson, who used to run Chronicle and later did Horizon. They went up to have a weekend at the Hill with open windows and no heating. And Alexander Thom was going to be made into a documentary, and the title was Cracking the Stone Age Code. These are pictures taken off the telly, and they're not very good, but they do show a different side to the character, because they were not staged, or no more staged than telly ever is. And I want to cover those now. So the first thing I want to cover is there's some shots of him actually at work shooting the sun to establish an exact bearing. Compasses, no, waste of time. Doing it from maps, difficult. Can be done. GPS, wonderful. They've come in since he died. But this is the classic way of establishing to within a 60th of a second the azimuth or the alignment. You pick a reference object, you go to the sun, you look it up in an ephemeris or an almanac, and you've got your line. That's Archie Thom doing that very function, his son, in Brittany. The BBC flew the entire family out to Brittany to test Thom's theories there. And there's the man who was implemental in getting all Thom's all the material of his life into the museum in Edinburgh, into the Royal Collection of historic artifacts and things related to antiquarian matters in Scotland. Ewan Mackay, a lecturer in archaeoastronomy and in archaeology at Glasgow University, and was the curator of the Hunterian Museum until about 2 years ago when he finally retired. This photo was taken in the year 2000 by myself. Good friend of Alexander Thom, and the only archaeologist who's done traditional archaeological work at a site to establish whether the archaeoastronomy data and the archaeological data can be tallied. So a bit of a hero of the piece, although in mainstream telly he said it's overwhelmingly probable that megalithic man was possibly conducting precision astronomical alignments, maybe, perhaps. But maybe in 1971 that was as far as mainstream archaeology was prepared to go. Now, this guy was 76 by the time they made the documentary, and I've had it from 3 people involved in the documentary that by the end of the day, they were completely wiped out, and this guy was still going. He was like Duracell battery advert, and he was a happy bunny on that. This is him sailing into Loch Rogue in the Isle of Lewis to recreate the epic journey he made in 1934 when he sailed into Loch Rogue and saw Callanish, and that started his interest in megaliths. There's Glyn Daniel, and right at the beginning of the documentary he says, you must excuse my Cambridge accent, but I have to do it. He says something like, the first thing to remember is as archaeologists we are beset by the lunatic fringe. The second thing is that Alexander Thom is not part of this. With that wonderfully patronising opening, Glyn Daniels supported Thom and indeed makes statements about megalithic astronomy on the programme, but within 5 years had completely turned and wouldn't publish anything as editor of Antiquity. Here's Richard Atkinson, who said something like, I think we have to take Professor Thom's work very seriously. No one, I am sure, is going to question the accuracy or the integrity of the data. Where they are going to have problems is with the implications. Because if we accept the implications, we have to accept the fact that things in the Bronze Age bore no relationship to how we think they were. But we think we have to take it seriously, because if we don't, we're flying in the face of an enormous body of evidence that cannot be ignored. Now, that doesn't sound like a chasm between archaeologists. It sounds like this guy got a load of data, saw it made sense, and said, we've got a problem here, let's solve it. But that wasn't to happen in archaeology after. And there's Jaquetta Hawkes. I'll imitate her. He seems to be a man of many choices. He's got this stone, he's got that stone, he's got the phase of the moon, he's got the sun, and if that stone doesn't fit, then this one does. And it all sounds rather incredible. Now, this woman was one of the key archaeological players involved in the diffusion theory, where civilization was said to have moved from the Middle East. And of course that theory in the 60s, when Cheerful Tom arrived, was crumbling because of radiocarbon redating and other information. And in some way one feels that if you follow the vested interest, her PhD thesis and several other things that were going on, she was a Newham scholar from Cambridge, some of the things that were going on were starting to crumble. And you can understand that there was some defensiveness there. This gentleman is Arthur Hogg, who questions very, very deeply the geometry of stone circles. He was from Lampeter, which is quite significant in view of what's going on at the moment. A Lampeter graduate. Made very insensible comments, but on the programme came over as entirely disappointing. And then we've got himself laughing at it all. And there's a lesson in prehistoric geometry being run on a beach with Magnus Magnusson helping. And there they are bonding over pipes in the chicken shed. And Magnus Magnusson said, if your ideas about the megalithic yard have got at the nose of archaeologists, then what about the idea of Pythagorean geometry, and does it bother you? And Tom bursts out laughing and says, no, not in the slightest. I just go on recording what I find, which of course is a true scientific sort of view of things, especially I've got, yeah, I could do belt and braces. Sig, you've got the braces. I'm back online here. Yeah, right. Well, let's look at some of these things. Let's look at his work in basic level. The first thing is the megalithic yard. This is covered in books, and you can go away and read those. But the essential thing about the megalithic yard is that all the vehicles that brought you here, despite all the contention, all the vehicles that brought you here have wheels in them with ball bearings. And the statistical analysis of the quality control of how big those ball bearings are, indeed the race they're in, and indeed the hub they're in, and indeed the wheel and the tyre they're on, have all been undertaken with a statistical analysis called the least squares method to detect error. Tom applied this, and he used the three top statisticians of his day in order to do that. They were Simon Broadbent, who John Michel mentioned earlier. They were John Hammersley, head of experimental science at Oxford, and they were eventually was David George Kendall, who I think if he's alive today will be 106, and he was 104 and still alive 2 years ago. Described as the most ferocious mathematician in Britain. And each one of them said, the megalithic yard, no problem, mate, really, 99% probability. But the fact is that the methods used for delivering the megalithic yard were not Tom's invention. He got his data by measuring eventually about 400 circles accurately, and then said to these guys, you decide the experiment, you give me the experiment to run, and then run it, which is a pretty good way of doing things. The megalithic yard is here. It also is very noticeably made up of a royal cubit and a foot. And there are all sorts of astronomical interesting things going on here which are not the subject of this lecture. So we might argue, and we have argued quite rightly, about the accuracy of the megalithic yard, and John Neal particularly and I have had a merry little dance together for years about it, and it's been fascinating. Fueled by John Michel's original research, that has led us to one or two interesting places which are not really the subject of today, but will be found in a couple of books that I've done, one with John Michel and a little bit in the wooden books. Let's look at the second part of Tom's work, which is the idea of solar and lunar alignments across the landscape. Here's what's going on this year. A lot of people, some of you from the Society of Lay Hunters, have been up to Callanish, and if you were lucky enough not to be bitten to death by midges, and on the right day, you would see the moon rising from this stone at the major standstill in the south, when it hardly rises at all, and it goes across the landscape. I'll just go back there and run that back. And there's Tom's theodolite set up on that point all those years ago. These are graphics, rather crude graphics, but they're gritty. I like them. So the idea is you take one of the luminaries. You've got a choice of two. One of them's sun, and the other one's the moon. You watch it set, and from a location where there is a standing stone or some megalithic, and you look for a natural outcrop on the horizon. As the sun goes down, the slope of the mountain acts as an amplifier for the angle. You can detect very minute angles. There's the sun disappeared. I can do this sort of with a crick neck. There's the sun disappeared for a moment, and then a few seconds later, and it is a few seconds, it glints in a gap in the stones. Now this is found worldwide as a phenomenon, but if you imagine that's the solstice and the sun never goes to the right of that position, you get the backside positioned rightly, and you can get the day of the year, and you've got your basic calendar. As Tom said, well, they wanted to be accurate. They wouldn't have been scientists if they weren't accurate, and they needed to know the length of the year. If they were going to predict eclipses, they would need to know the length of the year. Well, all of that's right on. But the problem he had during his life was that nobody believed these, in the archaeological world, would spend any time looking at the sites. They found several sites. This is a winter solstice site in Kintraw, where the setting sun, at about 212 degrees, sets in the Paps of Jura, that mountain there, and does a final glint. There's a standing stone, a burial mound, and then there's a platform across a ravine. And it was this site that Ewan Mackay said, right, if there's a platform and you can only observe it from the platform, and it was an interesting platform with huge stones on it, looked as though it had been laid as a pavement, I'll do a classic archaeological dig on it, which is what he promptly did. That was on the Chronicle programme. The outcome was that because they found no pots, it didn't have much impact. But the floor was shown by a technique called the Schmidt plot to have the floor laid horizontal. And Ewan Mackay has a film which you all must see and which I'm trying to get copyright free of from Glasgow University, showing the whole of the experiment in a very nice, well-presented format. For the summer solstice, there are 3 stones on the western side of Balacroy, which in the Bronze Age, or around the 2000 BC, would have shown the midsummer sun sliding down the slope of Cora Ben. And Tom did a lot of work there too. So here we have a man-made site from which you look, and you can then get your calendar. Now, John Martineau covered the circles, and that gives me a good excuse to flip through those. But basically, the geometry of stone circles was another major part of his work. He was insistent that they were using the megalithic yard to do right-angled triangles on the ground with pegs. 2 right-angled triangles that were clamped together, from which a radius from there draws that bit of the circle, a radius from there does this bit. This middle bit is used to define a semicircle, and then basically this bit is done from that point and a radius to there. Now the fact is, if you do this with a rope, it all becomes very easy.
Is this one working? Can you hear me?
Actually, I don't need a microphone.
Well, try this one. Do you fancy being a rock star?
Yeah. If I can be Jimi Hendrix. Yeah.
You can be. Take that one off. And just take that out of your pocket. Okay, let it rip.
Okay, that's fine. I'm much happier with that, and I can prove that I'm reasonably right and left-brained. So these circles used an integral number of megalithic yards. A 3, 4, 5 was common, often in units of 10. And we go on and we can flip through those. They made something like that, and here's some models that we use on sky and landscape courses, because actually the only way to do it is to do it on the ground or on boards with pins, because the rope actually plays a part in the process. There's I think from here that looks like a type 1 egg. There are models that I've made which enable this process to be understood. There's a type 2 egg, and there the hypotenuses, or longest sides of the triangle, are clamped together to do the same thing. These are rather rare, but they're not very pretty. They look like a sort of gear wheel thing, fan belt thing. There's a type B flattened circle. It's one of the ones that's captured my imagination and my research most. That's made from a Vesica piscis. And although Tom obviously didn't find this out about it, this length of this right-angled triangle here actually encodes the entire sun-moon system. From that triangle, you can predict eclipses, and you can get the calendar year and the spacing of the moons in the year. All you need is that particular triangle. That is unique to the type A and type B flattened circles. If you put a rope from there, which is how you make it, you come from a rope from there, round that peg, and you walk the rope round. At that point, it disengages from the peg, it draws this automatically, and then it engages with that peg and comes whirling around there. That's all there is to it. On the ground, it's much easier than describing it in a book through classical Euclidean geometry. So you can all go out and make one of these. It's a cosmic shape, because not only does it do this, but in fact, if you look at this, this is a 1, 3, root 10 triangle. The ancients needn't know any of that. Those are just numbers. But the fact is we know that. It's a 1, 3, 10 triangle. If you start here from the center, go down here, that's 3, that's root 10, and then you've got 2. And if you add that number up, you get 8.16444, which is exactly a quarter of a megalithic yard in inches. And that's interesting, because it's no reason why that should be the case, and yet it is. And this subject is full of these interesting things that no one's had the time or the research grants to look at. Let's move on. There's a type A circle. The best one I can think of is Castle Rigg, which you all must visit. Tor House ain't bad. Long Meg is a type B and is superb, and John covered that too. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that Tom had a problem with dating. When the archaeologists had him over star sets and rises, it was because they'd told him the Bronze Age ran from about 1500 to 2000 BC. When the archaeologists moved the time frame right back, Tom was left with a lot of data that was dirty. It wasn't any good. And so they had him over that. As these dates pushed back, it became obvious that one of the key things I needed to look at was where did this type A and type B structure that encodes the sun and the moon so brilliantly well come from? And Bryn Celli Ddu, which is in Wales on Anglesey, is a site like so many others where there's no formidable stone circle, but the henge around the monument, which I shall point at now, the grassy bank that rises with the stones in it, is a type A flattened circle. Those of you who've read Robert Lomas's book, Uriel's Machine, will know that on page 184, I think it is, a lecturer at Southampton University dates this at 4000 BC, and that seriously pushes knowledge of this geometry back. If you want proof that this was constructed other than as a Friday afternoon, you know, we made a bit of a mess of the entrance, then I can do no more to you than point out that if you look at that little row of meaningless stones there, which luckily have been left, they actually are the radius from the centre of the circle if it had not been flattened, and they're all more or less in situ. If only this gnome-like creature would move out of the way. That's another site well worth a visit. Yeah, let's go forward. That's an ellipse. That's a compound ring. We don't need to cover those. Jack Hawke said they had no way of recording the data. In the Type B, the data is recorded in the geometry. You put me on the ground in this room with no chairs in it and put a Type B there, I think within an hour I could give you the calendar for the next few years and tell you when the eclipses are, whether they're solar or lunar. I rest my case. The shape does that. And it seems very odd that we find this shape at all the observatories if there isn't a connection. These are score marks which show another way of recording data. These are just down the road from where I live, and the person who did that wasn't just messing around with a penknife. Okay, they're about an inch deep. What they mean, I can't tell you, but they're there within 2 miles of a major solar alignment and a major lunar alignment. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, because I've spoken for long enough, is let you watch a little film of an alignment. This is an alignment from a mountain near us, and the technician will take a little while to get it going. A mountain from us to two mountains near St. David's. And on a particular date of the year, the sun does some interesting things. It's a visual experience. You've had a lot of intellectual input, this conference, and I think the film that Sig showed was quite fun. I want you just to enjoy it. You can roll any time, Jake. I hope it works, that's all. Okay, that's fine. Could we go back to the slides, if possible? That's fine. I'd like to also point out the composer of one of the pieces in there, David, is with me. Can you stand up, David? David runs Post Office Records. And we've worked together on some very fiendishly interesting things, like an electronic model of the Aubrey Circle. I'd like to go now to some new research. We've got plenty of time. It's amazing. It's almost like the bread and the fishes up here. This site answers most of the objections that conventional archaeology have had about alignments. One of the objections is that this foresight, the mountain, is a natural feature. With this site, we take that one step further, but this site is multiple purpose, and it's also extremely accurate. This is a site near Moylegrove, just a little village near Cardigan, and we'll just go through. I won't go through it in great detail, but you'll get the gist of it. And there's the landscape, which is why I live there. Wouldn't you? This is going over to Voile-Dragarn, where there is 3 cairns. Dragarn means 3 cairns. You can actually see them on the top. Trig Point. There's our local television, where we get S4C. Endless programs about different types of sheep. Anybody from Wales here? Yeah. Viewers of Channel 4 will be severely amused to know that you're going to watch a program about 5 different types of sheep, while they watch an interesting documentary by Graham Hancock. There's the Preseli Bluestone site. There, Voile-Dragarn, Preseli Bluestone site. This is Preseli Top. That's where the stones from Stonehenge came from. And there's Voile-Dragarn in detail. I'll just whistle through them. There's the Preseli Bluestone site in more detail. And we go over to Preseli Top. And there's Carningley, which you saw in the film. That's the actual extinct volcano. And it's a place where some of you will know that dreaming experiments have gone on. It's a mystical place. And St. Brynach had a vision there. You may have watched the sunset on St. David's Day. Notice that from this site, that as often happens, the one house within a mile is on the line to the site. Okay, there's Lekadribeth mirroring in its capstone the top of the mountain, with something which I think is rather fun, although it might not be might not be relevant, but I'm sure that the people who built this monument were very, very careful to fit in as many little extras like we are on computers today. They had little widgets and bits of extra thing. So it's a portal dolmen with a huge chunky capstone. There's another one down the road, less than a mile and a half away, that's collapsed, and that has cup and ring marks on. And Glyn Daniel went to investigate it in the 50s. It's all written up. Okay, that mountain of gorse and wire there is because will become clear why that's there later, and why that other one. It's a ruined photograph, but it has a message which you'll see later on. It's 8 foot 4 inches high to the peak. There we are. And there's a plan of it, which is relevant with the latitude and longitude. The recording that Alexander Thom insisted we should do at every stone now gets done. And there's looking into the burial chamber from the rear and seeing how the outer stones, or the front stone, forms these 2 triangles. You can see them there more clearly. And there's one of them in another shot. And, of course, these triangles don't really mean much until you go there. And this is where the magic comes in, you see. Magic is right place, right time, appropriate action. I think that's the definition of magical process. If you go there on the summer solstice, and even more so if you were able to time travel back to 2750 BC, which is what the archaeologists date this as, you'd see that. Okay, the sun shines through one of those triangles. It sets into the sea horizon, which is about here. And we'll see that in a minute. There we are. So there's another shot on another year. Fortunately, midsummer, even in Wales, we do usually get some good nights for observation. Now, that may be meaningless. And indeed, I didn't publish anything on this. I just thought it was very interesting and very beautiful. I like the picture. So I, this year, decided to do something more positive about it, which was to actually do a second set of readings. There's the theodolite setup. On the exact axis of this, you can see the 2 centimetre square that holds up this 25-ton or 30-ton capstone. And there's the apex, and that's the axis of symmetry. You'll notice it is symmetrical, the monument. And that's looking out over the Irish Sea. And that's the view from the theodolite setup, and I'm very heartened to see that I properly leveled it. If you don't do that, you might as well not bother taking it. And there, in the distance, you can see what looks like just an island. This is extremely digitized telephoto, but that's what looks like an island. It's actually a mountain in Ireland. That's Bardsey Island, which is 50 miles away. The one in Ireland is 90 miles away, and it can only be seen very rarely. This can be seen quite more frequently. And the whole of the Llŷn Peninsula in Wales is here and looks like a set of little islands. It looks like a serpent in the sea. You can't see the ground level because the horizon has dipped. Okay, so there's the sequence of sunsets showing the sun from Lecca on that fence post that I marked up. And you can see quite clearly that the horizon, that either the sea is not level or that something's in the way. And as the sun sets, you can see, first of all, it being obstructed by one mountain and then going into the side of another. Okay, that's what you're actually seeing. Because of the change in the tilt of the Earth since megalithic times, you have to recreate. That's why you need a theodolite and all this complicated stuff and GPS in order to recreate where the sun would have set in megalithic times. And if you check that out, it dates pretty closely to the date of the monument. You have to do your homework, which means you get a map, you draw a horizon profile, and that complex there is what we were looking at. The sun was setting into that and then into the side of that, and it's a bit exaggerated in height terms. Everybody happy? Well, now we turn to the moon. This is taken from the site fairly recently, and that's a midsummer moon 10 years ago when I was just working with very grainy film. There is the Ordnance Survey map, the 1 to 25,000 scale map, and I want you to notice there's Lecca, that little black dot there. There's a tumulus, and there's a thing called a settlement, Caer. This is actually a barrow, and this is of uncertain origin but is a platform, and there is an exact straight line running between them, and guess where that line points? Well, I'll save a lot of tension and drum rolls and tell you it points to the major standstill of the moon. So I thought this was worth investigating, so I took the theodolite next to here, where I took a picture of the view. There's the third site, Caer, and you can just see the barrow there. And there's a whole set of interesting things there which the farmer is very keen for me to explore. Very, very interesting set of arrangement. But there's the alignment. It goes down there, over the barrow, up the hill, and to Lecca, which means slab on a large slab on a tripod, it means, or on a trivet. Welsh is very descriptive. It does what it says on the tin. There's Caer, which is a large levelish platform. I took a group there last weekend, of which 3 or 4 representatives are here at the conference. So they know it does what it says on the tin. And there's the alignment showing where it's based. It looks crooked because I'm a bit to one side. I am too. There's a stone on the thing. It's a blue stone and it's prostrate. The farmer tells me that when he ploughs, he puts stones next to it, so they're not megalithic, but this one may well be. And we call that station A, and the theodolite's pitched 2 feet away from it. There it is. That's station B with the theodolite pitched on it. And there's, as always, record where you are. And that's the view through the gorse, which I'm not allowed to touch because there are badgers living underneath it. So get the theodolite set up, see what you can see. There's the skyline taken through binoculars. Again, on this particular alignment, you can see the monument there, and you can also see the only house in the area is built on it. And that's something else. There's the skyline normally. And that's the view as it was when I first looked at the theodolite by putting a digital camera on the eyepiece. Another view of it, a third view of it. I don't know why there's so many, but it's all right. And that's after a day's gorse clearance. And you can see the monument clearly on the skyline there. At this point, it becomes possible to measure that azimuth and take some readings. That's an even better shot of it. And that's where the moon would have set in 2700 BC. As time goes on, the moon moves further back at the major standstill, but at the minor standstill, this site would clearly enable anybody to be able to watch the little 9-minute wobble up and down that determines when eclipses happen. It's synchronous with the eclipse year. And this site would clearly be able to do it. Now, on the 4th of April, I went at 3 in the morning. It's often cloudy, but I went out, not very hopeful, at 1:30 and waited there in the freezing weather. And actually, I want to show the final photograph, which was done by walking 80 feet to correct for the Earth's tilt change. I walked 80 feet up the road and took this photo. And I assure you, the spot was marked beforehand. It wasn't a question of running down the road to catch it. It was all gone in about a minute. And that's the picture. And that's, I'm afraid, all I've got for you today. And I'm a bit early, so we could do some questions before the forum. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we need another microphone, Gareth? Okay. Yes, Michael.
Is that on?
Yep.
Over the years, I've read that places like were mapped, covered in earth, and the Earth disappeared.
Right, so we've got the old Earth covering issue here.
Yeah.
Well,
was it or wasn't it? No.
I think that's a question for conventional archaeology to answer. I mean, I can supply all the archaeoastronomy information. That site, even were it covered, would still have been a marker for the major standstill of the moon. You're talking about 1.5 miles alignment. An extra 2 inches of Earth on the top wouldn't have made any difference to anything.
Yes, but some of the other things then, you wouldn't have got the sun shining through, would you?
No, unless you cut little velexes in the side. Put a tube down, yeah. Anybody else? There's a gentleman there. Can you wait to Gareth? Gareth gets fit now. Yes, yes.
Blimey. I can remember Ewan Mackay's Science and Society in Prehistoric Britain.
Yeah.
Did he write any other relevant books after that?
Yes, he wrote The Megalith Builders about Malta and the Mediterranean Portal Dolmen people. The funny thing about the first book, if I can just do an anecdote, is that, now it can be told, I guess, because he's retired, is that he wrote this book and in it he purported an elite that lived in places like the Sanctuary and Durrington Walls and the other sites. And he did archaeological work showing that they were eating the best cuts of meat. They had the nice pottery. They had the Laura Ashley prints on the wall and so on and so forth. And of course, it was very politically incorrect in an archaeological establishment that had been essentially run by people with Marxist sympathies quite a lot in the 40s. And for Gordon Child and co were quite self-professed Marxists. And so he submitted this book and got absolutely caned. But what he didn't tell the people who were reviewing it was that the editor of the book had been Richard Atkinson. And so that's out of the bag now. And of course, Richard Atkinson was considered, he was top table job, was Richard Atkinson. Okay, did that answer your question? Yeah.
Anybody else?
Anybody else got a question? Yes, Sig's got a question. Oh, well, the gentleman there has got the microphone. He who has the stick.
Could you tell us something about the current thrust of your research? What questions you're striving to research at this point?
Well, I think what has to happen, there are two things that I've identified, and it's one of the reasons why we set up the weekend courses at Sky and Landscape, was that there are some issues, practical and technical issues. It's no use doing this cerebrally. You need to know some astronomy and you need to know some surveying. But since Alexander Thom's time, and if you've read his books, you'll know that to say they're impenetrable is letting him off. He wrote a Victorian textbook, basically, and he wasn't indeed trying to write a popular book. But he did say to his cousin that who asked him why he hadn't written a child's guide to the subject, he said, well, only 25 people have ever read megalithic sites in Britain and understood it. And he never wrote the Child's Guide at all. It never came to light. So the first thing is, we've got GPS now, which makes checking alignments much easier. Because I am able to, with my background, I have been running for years and years a set of programs. I have to confess they're written in BASIC, which is saying like I've got a steam engine to go to work on. They're written in BASIC, but I'm in the process of negotiating their conversion into Java or C or one of the modern languages. And at the university, we're hoping to run those so that all those people out there, and you included, whose teeth chatter when the word maths comes up, or are artists and want to study this subject without any mathematical knowledge, can actually get a can opener on the technical side. You don't need a theodolite to do very valuable work, not perhaps to the precision that the theodolite does, but certainly adequate enough to establish whether there are alignments. And that's the other side of my question. Alexander Thom's sites have been done to death. They're in nearly every book. And nobody apparently is going out there doing new ones. So that last slideshow and the St. David's thing is my sort of contribution to the fact that actually it's Aladdin's cave in the British Isles. There's loads of this stuff out here. I hear anecdotes by email and by meeting people practically every day of my life about there is a stone where the light shines through, it's on the solstice. And it's 4 inches long in the stone, and it does it on the solstice, And I don't know whether the people have done accurate readings or not, but I do know that there's an enormous corpus of material available to answer this question, and it's actually the only question worth answering. John Michel put that very clearly, didn't he? I think it was in Megalithomania, where he says, for all the pick and shovel and the archaeology, the single question that the public want to know is, why were these things built? And what were they for? And what were the ancients, our own logo, what were the ancients up to? Now, that question needs answering, and there's some healing work needs to happen between academia and in order to do that. And that's really answered your question, I think. I hope it has. Yes. Gentleman there.
Have you been liaising with Clive Ruggles at all on any of his archaeoastronomy?
Have I what?
Have you been working with Clive Ruggles?
Well, no, and he was the only man in the course of writing the book on Thom that refused me an interview.
He's been all over Salisbury Plain this summer.
Yes.
And he claims to have found some new alignments.
Well, that's fine. This is not a time to sort of make personal remarks about anyone's work, but the issue is that towards the end of his life, Alexander Thom was very upset by the way Clive Ruggles got a large grant to check his circles. He wanted his work checking, but he wasn't happy with the statistics. In fact, indeed, in the book, I've got it's written down in a letter he wrote. He said, we'll have to, and he's blind at this point, of course, and he dictated it. He said, we will have to check these are disturbing results. And he's widened the boundaries of the alignment such that no longer can we apply the same statistical method. And that's fundamental. But you see, the average punter, the man in the street, if you like, he hasn't got the knowledge to know which is right and wrong. And I think Clive Ruggles did everyone a service by checking these. But in the BAR booklet, the great big thick book that no one's read outside of the profession, whilst he praises Thom in the forward, he's quite waspish later on. I mean, I've got no axe to grind. I think he has established the chair in archaeoastronomy in this country, and for that alone he's worthy of considerable praise, because he must have done it with some considerable opposition. But I think it might be time to take a slightly different tack on it, and it's always good to have competition. We have Apple, Mac and PC up there. Well, now we've got Lampeter and Leicester, 2 L's, which in Welsh is... Okay, any more questions? Sig.
I was interested in your astronomical alignment on St. David's Day, which, whether it was February 18th or March 1st, was that?
Yeah, well, the calendar
changed,
changed, you see. Yeah.
But St. David's a relatively recent dude. And
now I think there's a point being missed here, Sig.
Well, the question that I want to ask is like St. Bridget goes to a much older bride. Does that happen with St. David as well?
Well, one might imagine that even that the sighting of St. David's Cathedral might be relevant to finding a culture in Britain, and it might even be post-Christian culture, that was living out the remnants, and this was the way they fixed their calendar. What I didn't do on the film, because it would have detracted from the visual, is that at that site, because the year is 365 and a quarter days, you can pick up that quarter day every February the 18th when it's not cloudy, because the sun is quarter of a degree further over. And then every fourth year, you get an extra day. And that's actually what the mechanism of watching the sun on the horizon is. You get 3 years at 365 days, and then it plops back to the original position with 366. And that's how the quarter fits in. Now, that site has enabled me to get the year accuracy to 11 minutes just by standing there visually. You don't need a theodolite, telescope, or anything.
And it's interesting that that extra day is added right next to March 1st.
Well, I mean, March the 1st is the saint day for St. David. It's usually the date of the death of the king, or isn't it? The saint's day is usually the day of his death. But David is noted to have died on March the 1st.
But what I meant by that was the 29th of February is the extra day.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is the extra day. It's in that same month. So, I mean, we don't know the origins of an accurate calendar. We think, have thought it comes from Babylon or Greece or Egypt, but in fact, this site is perfectly well equipped to give it you to within a few minutes with a bit of work, and it's there every year for you. And I think what I'm saying is, I think that it's a cultural overlay. St. David, like all the churches were built on ancient sites, well, so perhaps were the calendar systems and all of that were built on the Celtic Christian, and which goes back perhaps to the Druids and the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. Thank you. Yes, Nick.
Yes, I've come across Clive Ruggles a bit this last year and found him extraordinarily dogmatic in dismissing all the work, not just of Thom, but of Gerald Hawkins and Clive and Hoyle. And basically, anything to do with a solar alignment is okay, and that's statistics. And anything lunar is numerology. Any idea that they could count the numbers of the stones or interest in lunar cycles would be dismissed as numerology. Yes. So I feel there's a very strong prejudice here, which might have a gender component.
Well, here, the site we've just looked at, with 3 man-made sites in an alignment. So first of all, we can say they are aligned. It might not mean anything, but the fact that alignment points to the most northerly set of the moon is not numerology. I hate to use the word fact, but I mean, if you're there at 3 a.m. with a camera and you walk to this spot and go click, and there's the moon setting, I think you can say that, providing you've done your sums well, that's where it sets.
And I mean, nobody published more than Thom in academic journals.
No, not at all.
And I'm amazed that it can be so dismissed within a generation.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think that's a very valuable comment. I mean, the list of his papers fills 5 pages of A4. He wrote in refraction, grinding astronomical telescope lenses. He was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, so he did a whole load of work there. He was the master expert on field dynamics in physics. He wrote a book on that. He designed this wind tunnel, and there was all sorts of stuff to do with airflow over aerofoils that he did. And he was a master mariner and navigator and built so many things. I mean, this guy was a dude. I'm quite happy I've done now, so thank you very much for your time.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.